Please don't let them burn us." The voice was so soft that Evelyn Hale almost thought the winter wind had imagined it for her. She stopped walking. Snow crunched beneath her boots as the cold bit through the thin wool of her coat, moonlight spilling silver across the frozen trail ahead. Her basket of moonroot herbs bumped lightly against her hip, the bitter scent of crushed leaves mixing with pine and wood smoke in the freezing air. It was solstice night, the longest night of the year, when every sensible wolf stayed close to fire and family. But Evelyn had long ago stopped expecting either. The farther edge of Ash Hollow Pack had become her world. A tiny cabin with a leaking roof, shelves lined with dried herbs and silence thick enough to ache. Rejected Omega. Defective healer. Too weak to shift properly. She had heard every version of herself spoken by other people's mouths. Tonight though something felt wrong. The forest sounded wrong. No owls. No distant howl drifting through the mountains. Even the wind seemed hesitant, whispering through the branches as if afraid to disturb something sleeping beneath the snow. Then she heard it again. A cry. High-pitched. Frightened. Young. Evelyn froze so suddenly that her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't human. Not exactly. It sounded like the frightened whimper of a pup trying very hard not to cry. Her chest tightened. Every instinct inside her pulled hard in one direction. She stepped off the trail. Branches scraped her sleeves as she pushed deeper between towering pines, boots sinking several inches into untouched snow. The smell hit her first. Smoke. Wax. Burned cedar. Ritual smoke. Her stomach twisted. Nobody should be holding ceremonies this far into the forest, not near the old stone grounds. The elders had forbidden gatherings there years ago after whispers of strange solstice traditions that no one liked discussing in daylight. Evelyn slowed when flickering orange light appeared between the trees. Voices drifted through the dark. Low. Chanted. Male. Her pulse quickened. She crouched behind an old fallen cedar, the rough bark cold against her fingertips, and looked through the trees. First nothing. Made sense. 6 figures huddled together inside a stone circle, silver fur glowing beneath firelight. Tiny bodies trembling. Small paws tied loosely with braided rope. Wolf pups. 6 of them. Evelyn's breath vanished from her lungs. Around them stood men in dark robes, their hoods shadowing their faces as torches hissed softly in the winter air. Symbols had been painted into the snow around the circle, black ash against white frost. One man stepped forward, raising both hands toward the moon hanging pale and enormous overhead. "The moon must be given what was promised," he said, voice calm and cold. One of the pups whimpered, trying to crawl backward, but its tiny leg trembled too hard to stand. Evelyn felt something inside her twist painfully. No ceremony should involve frightened children. No ritual should sound like fear. Then the smallest pup lifted its head. Bright silver eyes locked onto hers through the darkness as if it somehow knew she was there. And in a voice no louder than a shaking whisper, soft enough to disappear into the wind, it said, "Please help us." Evelyn did not think. Fear had a way of freezing most wolves in place, but something older and quieter moved inside her before fear could catch up. Maybe it was the memory of too many nights spent unwanted. Maybe it was the sight of 6 trembling creatures trying not to cry. Or maybe it was simply because nobody had ever stepped in for her. The smallest pup shivered so hard its silver fur barely hid the shape of tiny ribs beneath. Its frightened eyes stayed locked on hers, full of something that did not belong in someone so small. Trust. Desperation. Hope. Evelyn swallowed hard. Cold air scraped her lungs as she rose slowly from behind the fallen cedar. The men had not noticed her yet. Their chanting continued, low and rhythmic, blending with the hiss of torchlight and the whisper of snow falling through pine branches overhead. One of them carried a long branch wrapped in glowing solstice ribbons, moving carefully around the circle while murmuring words Evelyn did not recognize. She hated rituals she could not understand. Too many powerful wolves liked to hide cruelty behind old traditions. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her herb basket. Moonroot leaves spilled onto the snow unnoticed. A sharp gust carried the scent of cedar smoke and melted wax toward her, thick enough to sting her eyes. The 6 pups huddled closer together. One had a tiny paw wrapped protectively over another as though trying to comfort it. Another sat unnaturally still, pale ears pressed flat against its head. These were children. No matter what shape they wore, Every healer instinct inside Evelyn screamed the same truth. Children. A memory surfaced uninvited. 10 years old. Sitting alone outside the pack gathering hall after another failed shifting lesson while older wolves laughed quietly inside. Defective. Weak. Broken. She remembered the feeling of wanting someone, anyone, to notice she was hurting. Nobody had. The ache of that old loneliness tightened painfully inside her chest. Not tonight, she thought. Not for them. She stepped out from the shadows before courage could leave her. Snow crunched beneath her boots. The chanting stopped immediately. Several hooded figures turned toward her at once. Silence settled over the clearing so suddenly it felt heavy. One of the men lowered his torch. "Who is there?" he demanded, voice rough with irritation. Evelyn nearly stepped back. Her pulse thundered against her ribs. But then the smallest pup whimpered again, and fear lost its grip. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice quieter than she wanted but steady enough to survive the cold. Nobody answered right away. The tallest man stood near the center stone, dark robes moving slightly in the wind. His hood shadowed most of his face. "This does not concern you," he said calmly. "Return to your home." Evelyn looked past him toward the pups. One had started trembling again. Another tried weakly to tug at the rope around its paw. "They are scared," she said softly. "Why are they tied up?" A few of the men exchanged glances. One gave a short laugh beneath his hood. "You should leave before you embarrass yourself, Omega." The word landed exactly the way they intended. Small. Inferior. Disposable. Evelyn felt heat creep into her face despite the freezing air. She recognized the tone immediately. Pity mixed with contempt. She had lived inside it her whole life. Usually she would lower her head. Apologize. Walk away. Tonight, though, something felt different. The moon overhead looked impossibly large, pale silver spreading across the clearing like watchful light. And somewhere deep inside her chest, quiet but stubborn, came one impossible thought. If nobody saves them, who will? The tallest man tilted his head slightly, as though Evelyn had become mildly interesting instead of inconvenient. Snow drifted between them in slow white spirals, catching the orange glow of torchlight before disappearing against the frozen ground. Somewhere above, branches groaned softly beneath fresh ice, and the cold pressed harder against Evelyn's skin, sharp enough to sting. Nobody moved. The silence stretched too long. Then the man spoke again. "The solstice requires balance," he said, calm in a way that unsettled her more than anger would have. "Winter takes. Winter gives. This offering protects the packs from hunger, sickness, and loss." Evelyn frowned. Something about his voice felt rehearsed, too smooth, as if he had said these words many times before and no one had ever challenged him. She glanced at the 6 pups again. The smallest had not stopped watching her. Tiny breaths escaped its nose in trembling clouds, silver fur ruffled by the wind. Another pup leaned weakly against its side, eyes half closed with exhaustion. None of them looked dangerous. None of them looked willing. "They are terrified," Evelyn said quietly. "That does not look like balance." A ripple of irritation moved through the robed men. One shifted his weight. Another muttered something beneath his breath that she could not fully hear. "Weak Omega. Foolish girl." The words landed like old bruises. Familiar. Predictable. She should have been used to it by now. Maybe she was. But tonight, standing beneath the pale solstice moon with 6 frightened pups staring at her like she was their last chance, the insults felt strangely small. The tallest man folded his hands inside his sleeves. "You misunderstand," he said. "The moon chooses sacrifice." Evelyn's chest tightened. She had heard versions of that sentence before. When crops failed. When someone disappeared. When weaker wolves were quietly blamed for bad luck no one could explain. The moon chooses. The moon demands. Funny how the moon always seemed to ask the weakest to suffer. Her fingers curled against the strap of her basket. "Did the moon tell them they had to be tied up?" she asked softly. For the first time, a few of the men looked uncomfortable. One stepped forward, boots crunching against the snow. He was broader than the others, his hood slipping back enough to reveal a gray beard and hard eyes. "Careful, girl," he said. "You are speaking above your station." Station. The word settled heavily between them. Evelyn knew exactly what he meant. Omega. Female. Unimportant. The kind of wolf who healed scraped hands and stayed quiet during ceremonies. Not someone who questioned powerful men wrapped in sacred robes. Her stomach twisted, but she held her ground. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying something strange toward her. Beneath cedar smoke and melted wax, she caught another scent. Clean frost. Pine. Wild mountain air after snowfall. Familiar somehow, though she could not place why. It disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Evelyn frowned but said nothing. Her attention snapped back when the smallest pup let out another tiny sound, barely louder than a sigh. It tried to stand, stumbled, then looked toward her again with heartbreaking trust. The movement exposed something beneath its fur. Around its neck, hidden under silver strands, hung a delicate chain holding a small crescent-shaped crest that caught moonlight. Evelyn blinked. She had seen that symbol before. Not up close. Never up close. Only carved into banners hanging outside government halls. Royal insignia. Her pulse stumbled. No, that was impossible. Royal wolves did not vanish into forests. Royal wolves definitely did not end up tied inside hidden solstice rituals. Unless someone had worked very hard to make sure nobody asked questions. Cold unease crept slowly down her spine. Suddenly, the clearing felt much too quiet, much too hidden. And for the first time that night, Evelyn stopped wondering whether she should interfere and started wondering what kind of danger she had already stepped into. The smallest pup stumbled again, and this time Evelyn moved without thinking. One careful step, then another. Snow cracked softly beneath her boots as she approached the stone circle, heart pounding hard enough to make her ribs ache. The silver crescent pendant still glimmered faintly beneath the pup's fur, catching moonlight every time it trembled. Royal. The thought echoed uneasily through her mind. Not rumored royal blood. Not noble families trying to act important. True royal lineage. Wolves connected to the Alpha King himself. Her throat tightened. What were 6 royal pups doing hidden in the forest on solstice night? Worse, why did nobody seem afraid of what would happen if someone found out? Do not take another step. The tallest man's voice sliced cleanly through the cold air. Evelyn stopped. The torchlight flickered across his robes as he slowly descended from the center stone, measured and calm, like a man completely certain he controlled the outcome of every conversation. Behind him, the others shifted closer together. Watching. Waiting. The smallest pup let out another weak sound, pressing lower to the frozen ground as though trying to disappear. Evelyn hated how familiar that fear looked. They are freezing, she said quietly. At least untie them. A few of the men laughed softly beneath their hoods. One sounded genuinely amused. You still think this concerns Mercy, another muttered. Poor thing. The gray-bearded man folded his arms. You misunderstand what you are seeing, he said. These creatures are dangerous. Evelyn blinked. Dangerous? Her eyes moved over the 6 tiny bodies huddled together, silver ears pinned back against frightened little heads. One barely seemed strong enough to stand. Another kept nudging the smallest closer to warmth. They looked exhausted, cold, and scared. Dangerous was the wrong word entirely. They are pups, she said, voice firmer now. Children. Not ordinary children, the tallest man replied smoothly. There are wolves born carrying ruin, darkness, sickness, misfortune. His eyes lingered on her just long enough to make the meaning painfully clear. Defective, broken, dangerous. Evelyn knew exactly how people justified cruelty when they wanted permission to stop feeling guilty. Her stomach twisted. Who decided that? She asked. The man tilted his head slightly. The moon gives signs. Or powerful people decide what signs mean, she said before she could stop herself. Silence. Real silence this time. The kind that settles before storms. Somewhere in the distance, wind rushed through the mountain trees with a low mournful sound. Several robed men stiffened. One muttered something under his breath that sounded uneasy. The tallest man's calm expression shifted, only briefly. Careful, Omega, he said softly. You are standing very far outside your place. Place again. Always place. As if the world had invisible lines wolves like her were expected to obey. Stay quiet. Stay small. Do not ask questions. Do not interfere. Heal wounds no one else wants to touch and pretend it is enough. Evelyn looked at the 6 pups again. The smallest had curled into itself, tiny body trembling against the snow. Its eyes fluttered tiredly but still found hers. Trusting her. Somehow trusting her. Something warm and painful spread through Evelyn's chest. Maybe because she remembered too clearly what it felt like when nobody chose you. Nobody defended you. Nobody cared enough to stand between you and fear. Slowly, carefully, she set her herb basket down in the snow. The cedar smoke scratched at her throat as cold wind pulled loose strands of brown hair across her face. Then, before fear could talk her out of it, Evelyn stepped over the edge of the stone circle. The moment Evelyn crossed into the stone circle, the air changed. It felt colder somehow, sharper against her skin, as though the forest itself had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe. The symbols carved into the snow beneath her boots shimmered faintly in the torchlight, black ash twisting into patterns she did not recognize. Something about them unsettled her. Old magic. Hidden magic. The kind whispered about in stories told only after midnight. Behind her, boots shifted against packed snow. One of the robed men stepped forward immediately. "Leave the circle," he ordered, his voice no longer patient. "Now." Evelyn ignored him. Her attention stayed on the 6 pups huddled together. Up close, they looked even smaller than she had realized. Their silver fur was tangled from cold and damp, tiny bodies pressed tightly together for warmth. One had a small scrape near its paw. Another looked exhausted, blinking slowly as though fighting sleep. The smallest one, the one who had spoken to her, barely held its head upright. Its little chest rose and fell too quickly. Fear. Exhaustion. Cold. Healer instincts moved through Evelyn automatically. She crouched slowly, careful not to startle them. "Hey," she whispered softly, her voice gentler than the wind slipping through the pines. "You are okay. I am here." The smallest pup flinched at first. Then, hesitantly, it crawled closer, tiny paws trembling against frozen stone. When it pressed weakly against her knee, something inside Evelyn's chest cracked open. No child should feel this scared. No child should have to decide whether trusting someone was worth the risk. "Do not touch them." The tallest man's voice echoed sharply through the clearing. Evelyn looked over her shoulder. The robed men stood rigid now, tension replacing earlier confidence. Strange. If this ritual was truly sacred, why did they suddenly look nervous? "They need warmth," Evelyn said quietly. "And food. Probably water." One man scoffed. "You think like a healer because that is all you are." The words should have hurt. Usually they did. Just a healer. Not strong enough to lead. Not important enough to matter. But tonight, kneeling beside 6 frightened pups under the cold solstice moon, healer suddenly felt like enough. Maybe more than enough. Slowly, Evelyn slipped off her thick wool scarf. The cold immediately bit harder against her neck, but she ignored it and carefully draped the fabric around the smallest pup. It froze in surprise, blinking up at her with wide silver eyes. For one strange second, something warm flickered beneath her palm where her hand brushed its fur. Faint. Golden. Gone too quickly to understand. Evelyn frowned. Had she imagined that? The pup seemed to notice too. Stared at her hand with quiet wonder before nestling shakily into the warmth of the scarf. A soft sound escaped it, almost like relief. Behind her, several of the men shifted uneasily again. "This has gone far enough," the gray-bearded man snapped. "You do not understand what they are." Evelyn looked down at the crescent pendant resting against silver fur. Royal blood. Hidden in the woods. Terrified. Bound during a secret ritual. Nothing about this felt right. Her stomach tightened painfully. "Then explain it," she said, rising slowly to her feet. Snow drifted lazily between them as torchlight danced across dark robes and frozen faces. "Because right now, it looks a lot like frightened children surrounded by adults who should know better." Silence answered her. Real silence. The kind that told her she had finally asked the question nobody wanted spoken aloud. Then somewhere deep in the forest, low and distant enough to almost miss, something howled. The howl rolled through the mountains again, lower this time, deep enough to seem less like sound and more like pressure against Evelyn's chest. The pups reacted instantly. Every silver head lifted. The smallest one pressed harder into the folds of her scarf, trembling less from fear now and more from something closer to hope. Evelyn noticed it immediately. Recognition. Whatever had made that sound, the pups knew it. The robed men knew it too. Calm vanished from the clearing so quickly it almost startled her. One man stepped backward. Another looked toward the tree line as though calculating distance. Even the tallest man no longer seemed completely composed. "Finish this," the gray-bearded man muttered under his breath. "Now." Evelyn's stomach dropped. "Finish what?" she asked sharply. Nobody answered. Instead, two of the robed men moved toward the stone circle, boots crunching fast across frozen ground. Something cold twisted through Evelyn's chest. Not fear exactly. Instinct. The kind that arrives 1 second before something goes terribly wrong. She stepped in front of the pups without thinking. "Do not come closer," she said. Her voice shook slightly, but she stayed where she was. One of the men laughed once, humorless and impatient. "Move aside, Omega." Evelyn swallowed hard. Every survival instinct screamed at her to back away. Wolves like these carried power. Influence. The kind of authority that ruined people who stepped out of line. She had spent years making herself smaller to survive men exactly like this. But behind her, 6 frightened pups shifted closer together, tiny bodies pressing against her legs for warmth. The smallest gave another soft whine and nudged weakly against her hand. Something stubborn rose quietly inside her. "No, not tonight. They are scared," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "Whatever this is, it can stop." The tallest man exhaled slowly through his nose, patience visibly thinning. "You misunderstand the cost of mercy," he said. "There are futures far worse than sacrifice." Evelyn frowned. The words felt rehearsed again. Convenient. Like excuses someone repeated until they sounded like truth. Her gaze drifted to the pups once more. One of them, slightly larger than the others, sat unnaturally still. Around its neck rested another crescent crest, but this one carried tiny engraved stars surrounding it. More elaborate. More important somehow. Royal family. Definitely royal family. Her pulse quickened painfully. If these children belonged to the Alpha King's bloodline, this was not some forgotten ritual hidden in the woods. This was treason. Or kidnapping. Or something even darker nobody wanted named aloud. Snow swirled harder suddenly, wind threading through the clearing with sharp icy fingers. The torches flickered wildly. Somewhere beyond the trees came the distant crack of branches shifting under heavy movement. Big movement. Too large for deer. Too controlled for panic. The men heard it too. One cursed softly beneath his breath. Another tightened his grip around the wooden staff he carried. Fear moved through them now. Real fear. Evelyn's heartbeat stumbled. Whatever approached, these men had not expected it. The smallest pup tugged weakly at her sleeve. When she looked down, silver eyes blinked slowly up at her. "Do not let them take us," it whispered, voice fragile enough to break something inside her. Evelyn's throat tightened. Painfully. Nobody had ever asked her to protect them before. Nobody had trusted her with anything important. Usually she was overlooked. Dismissed. Forgotten. But right now, 6 terrified children were looking at her like she mattered. Like she could actually change something. She slowly rose to her feet, shoulders squaring despite the cold that burned through her coat. Then, before fear could swallow courage whole, Evelyn spread her arms slightly in front of the pups and said the one thing nobody in her position was ever supposed to say. No, the words seemed to freeze the clearing harder than winter itself. No. Simple. Quiet. Impossible. For a second, nobody reacted. Snow drifted lazily through the torchlight while wind whispered through ancient pine branches overhead. Evelyn could hear her own breathing now, shallow and uneven against the pounding of her pulse. The pups huddled tighter behind her legs, tiny bodies brushing against the backs of her boots, as if they had already decided she belonged between them and danger. One of the robed men let out a sharp laugh, disbelieving enough to sound almost nervous. Did the Omega just refuse? Another shook his head slowly. She does not understand what she is standing in front of. The tallest man watched her carefully now. Not amused anymore. Not dismissive either. Evaluating. Like he was trying to understand why someone so easily overlooked had suddenly become difficult. "Move aside," he said again, quieter this time. "This does not end well for wolves who interfere." Evelyn hated how fear immediately tightened her stomach. Wolves like him spoke with the confidence of people who had never been questioned. And she knew exactly what happened to people who pushed too hard against authority. Pack whispers. Isolation. Punishment hidden behind polite words. She had survived years by staying quiet, by apologizing even when she had done nothing wrong. But then the smallest pup pressed weakly against her ankle again. Tiny and cold. Trusting her anyway. Her chest ached unexpectedly. "You keep saying I do not understand," Evelyn said softly. "So explain it to me." Her breath clouded in the icy air. "Explain why frightened. Children are tied up in the woods." No one answered immediately. Instead, the gray-bearded man stepped closer, irritation finally breaking through whatever patience remained. "You ask questions above your station," he snapped. "These are royal matters." Royal. The word landed hard. Several of the men visibly stiffened, realizing too late what they had revealed. Evelyn's heartbeat stumbled painfully. She had guessed, but hearing it aloud made everything suddenly heavier. Royal matters. Royal children. Hidden deep in forbidden woods under the cover of Solstice night. Her mouth went dry. "Then someone important is probably looking for them," she said quietly. One of the men cursed beneath his breath. Another turned sharply toward the forest as though listening for something. That scent drifted through the clearing again. Frost. Pine. Mountain air sharp enough to feel clean. Stronger this time. Familiar in a strange way that made something instinctive inside Evelyn sit up and pay attention. The pups noticed too. The larger silver one lifted its head suddenly, ears twitching. Hope flashed openly across its small face. "He is close," it whispered so softly Evelyn almost missed it. Her eyes widened. "He." Before she could ask, the gray-bearded man spoke again, voice strained now. "Enough," he barked. "Take the pups." Two men stepped forward. Evelyn moved before thinking, instinct faster than reason. She spread her arms wider, placing herself fully between them and the frightened children. "No," she said again, louder this time. The wind shifted violently. Torches hissed. Somewhere deep in the mountains came another howl. Closer now. Much closer. Low enough to vibrate through the frozen ground beneath her boots. The reaction was instant. Several robed men went pale beneath their hoods. One took an unconscious step backward. Another muttered, "That cannot be possible." Evelyn swallowed hard. Whatever approached it terrified them. Truly terrified them. Behind her, the smallest pup looked up with wide silver eyes and whispered words so quiet they barely survived the wind. He came. The forest went still in a way that did not feel natural. Not quiet. Still. As if every living thing had paused to listen. Snow drifted slowly through the clearing, untouched by wind now, and the torches hissed uneasily against the cold. Evelyn could feel it in the frozen ground beneath her boots. Something was coming. Something big. The robed men felt it too. Whatever calm they had been pretending to hold was slipping. One man glanced toward the trees again, hands tightening around his staff. Another whispered urgently to the tallest figure, voice low enough Evelyn could not fully hear. But she caught one sentence clearly. "He should not have found this place." Her stomach tightened. The smallest pup pressed closer against her ankle, tiny body no longer trembling quite as hard. Hope had replaced some of the fear in its silver eyes. "Who came?" Evelyn asked quietly. The pup looked up at her, ears twitching toward the forest. "Our uncle," it whispered. "Uncle." Evelyn's pulse skipped painfully. Royal blood. Missing children. A powerful relative searching for them. Everything suddenly felt much more dangerous than she had realized. The tallest man straightened sharply, voice colder now. "Enough waiting," he said. "Take the heirs and leave." Heirs. The word hit Evelyn like winter water. Not distant relatives. Not noble children. Heirs. Royal heirs. Important enough to hide. Important enough for people to risk something terrible to keep secret. One of the larger pups lowered its head sadly. "They lied," it whispered softly. "They said father sent them." Something inside Evelyn twisted painfully. Children trusted too easily. Especially frightened ones. "Nobody is taking anyone," she said quietly, though her heart pounded hard enough to make breathing difficult. She turned slightly, shielding the pups behind her again. Not until someone explains what is happening. The gray-bearded man exhaled sharply through his nose. Move, he said, irritation finally overtaking patience. You are making a mistake you cannot survive. Evelyn almost stepped back. Almost. Fear rushed through her in cold waves. She knew wolves like this. Men with power. Men who expected obedience simply because they demanded it. Wolves who made smaller people disappear socially, quietly, efficiently. She had spent years surviving by making herself invisible around them. But invisible people never got protected. Invisible people got forgotten. The smallest pup brushed weakly against her leg again, scarf wrapped awkwardly around its tiny shoulders. It trusted her. Somehow trusted her more than the adults surrounding them. That trust settled heavy and warm in Evelyn's chest. She swallowed hard and stood straighter. Then I guess I will make it, she said softly. For 1 second nobody moved. Then the clearing changed. A sudden gust of icy wind tore through the trees hard enough to scatter snow across the stone circle. Torches flickered violently. Branches groaned overhead. And from somewhere beyond the dark tree line came the unmistakable sound of something massive moving through the forest. Not hurried. Not clumsy. Controlled. Deliberate. The roped men froze. One stumbled backward. Another quietly removed his hood, face pale beneath moonlight. Fear. Real fear. The tallest man's calm expression finally cracked. Impossible, he muttered. Then the scent hit the clearing all at once. Frost. Pine. Wild mountain air sharp enough to steal breath straight from lungs. Powerful enough to make instinct rise inside Evelyn before thought could catch up. Every pup reacted instantly. Tiny heads lifted. Silver eyes brightened. Even the exhausted ones pushed shakily to their feet. The smallest one looked up at Evelyn and whispered with sudden certainty. He found us. Then just beyond the tree line, 2 glowing silver eyes appeared in the darkness. The eyes did not move at first. They simply watched from the darkness beyond the trees, silver enough to catch moonlight and hold it like frozen metal. Evelyn forgot how to breathe. Everything inside the forest had gone impossibly quiet. No wind. No branches creaking overhead. Even the distant sounds of winter seemed to disappear beneath the weight of whatever stood hidden between the pines. The roped men looked afraid now. Truly afraid. One stumbled backward so quickly he nearly lost his footing in the snow. Another whispered something that sounded suspiciously like prayer. The tallest man stood frozen near the center stone, jaw tight beneath his hood. Gone was the calm certainty from earlier. Gone was the practiced patience. In its place sat something colder. Panic trying very hard to look controlled. Behind Evelyn, the pups shifted restlessly. Tiny paws scraped softly against frozen stone. The smallest one nudged her calf again, no longer trembling with fear but anticipation. Hope. Strange, fragile hope. He is angry, it whispered quietly. Evelyn looked down, startled. Who? She asked, though part of her already knew. The pup swallowed hard. Our uncle does not like when people lie. Before Evelyn could answer, movement finally broke through the darkness. Slow. Measured. Deliberate. A shape emerged from the tree line, large enough to make instinct react before reason could catch up. Her pulse stumbled painfully. Wolf. But far larger than any she had ever seen. Massive black fur caught streaks of moonlight like polished obsidian. Each movement controlled with unnerving precision. Not wild. Not frantic. Powerful. Terribly powerful. Snow crunched beneath enormous paws as the creature stepped fully into view. It carried itself with impossible stillness, shoulders broad and heavy beneath thick winter fur. Frost clung faintly to its coat as though cold itself belonged to it. The scent that had drifted through the clearing earlier surrounded them completely now. Pine forests after snowfall. Cold mountain wind. Something ancient and impossibly steady beneath it all. Every instinct Evelyn possessed reacted instantly. Not fear exactly. Recognition. Respect. Something older than thought pressing quietly into her bones. The pups reacted immediately. Tiny tails wagged weakly. One let out a relieved sound. Another tried to stand too quickly and nearly stumbled. Uncle Cashin. The larger pup whispered softly, voice cracking with emotion. Cashin. Evelyn's stomach dropped. Cassian Ashford, the Alpha King. Stories about him traveled through every pack in the Northern Territories. Wolves lowered their voices when speaking his name. They said he ruled colder than winter itself. That enemies disappeared quietly. That even rival alphas avoided challenging him directly. And right now, he stood 20 feet away in the shape of something far more intimidating than rumor had prepared her for. The roped men slowly lowered their heads. No one spoke. No one dared. The massive black wolf stopped at the edge of the stone circle. Silver eyes moved once over the pups, pausing long enough to count them. Relief flickered there so quickly Evelyn almost missed it. Then the gaze shifted. Slowly, deliberately, landing on her. Heat climbed unexpectedly into Evelyn's face despite the freezing air. She realized suddenly what this looked like. A rejected Omega standing inside a forbidden ritual, shielding 6 royal heirs while facing down powerful men she had no business challenging. Her heart hammered painfully. She should step back. Should explain herself. Should apologize. But then the smallest pup pressed closer against her scarf again, trusting her without hesitation. Evelyn lifted her chin slightly instead. Quietly, almost more to herself than anyone else, she whispered into the freezing night. They are safe. The wolf did not blink. Did not move. But something unreadable shifted in those silver eyes. For one endless moment nobody moved. Snow drifted softly between them, catching silver moonlight before disappearing against black fur and frozen stone. Evelyn could hear her own heartbeat now, hard enough to make her ears ring. The Alpha King stood impossibly still at the edge of the clearing, silver eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the cold suddenly feel sharper. Not angry. Not confused. Watching. Evaluating. Like he was trying to understand something that did not make sense. Behind Evelyn, the pups finally broke their frightened silence. The largest one stepped forward first, small body trembling with exhaustion. Uncle Cassian, it said again, voice fragile but relieved. They said father sent them. Something changed in the wolf instantly. Not outwardly dramatic. A tightening around the eyes. A stillness that somehow became heavier. Colder. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. The roped men lowered their heads further. Nobody dared speak. Nobody dared explain. The Alpha King moved at last. One slow step forward. Then another. Snow. Compressed softly beneath massive paws. The scent of frost and mountain air grew stronger, steady and clean enough to cut through cedar smoke and old fear. Evelyn's breath caught painfully. Close he seemed even larger. Powerful in a way that felt impossible to measure. Not loud power. Not the kind wolves bragged about in pack houses after too much whiskey. Quiet power. Certain power. The kind that never needed permission. The smallest pup gave a soft cry and suddenly stumbled toward him, scarf slipping awkwardly from tiny shoulders. Without hesitation, the great black wolf lowered himself just enough for the pup to press shakily against thick fur. Relief moved visibly through the little body. One by one, the others followed, huddling near him with tired whimpers and exhausted trust. Evelyn felt something tight in her chest loosen unexpectedly. Safe. They were finally safe. The Alpha King lowered his head briefly toward the pups, checking each one with surprising gentleness. One tiny nose nudged against his fur. Another leaned heavily against his front leg. Whatever terrifying stories people told about him, none of them had prepared Evelyn for this quiet tenderness. Then the smallest pup looked back toward her. She saved us, it whispered. 6 small faces turned her way at once. Trust. Gratitude. Hope. The kind of expressions Evelyn had never once seen directed at her before. Heat crept unexpectedly into her cheeks. She suddenly became very aware of herself. Mud on her boots. Hair falling loose from the wind. A rejected Omega standing awkwardly inside forbidden ritual markings, while speaking to the most feared man in the Northern Territories. The absurdity of it almost made her dizzy. Slowly, the Alpha King lifted his head again. Silver eyes settled on her once more. Close now. Too close. Close enough that Evelyn could see intelligence there. Weariness too. Something sharp hidden beneath control. She swallowed hard. Her voice came out smaller than intended. They were scared. Brilliant silver eyes did not leave her face. Then unexpectedly the great wolf stepped closer. Evelyn's pulse stumbled. Every instinct screamed at her to step back, but she could not seem to move. The cold air shifted around him, pine and frost wrapping through the clearing like winter itself had chosen a shape. He stopped only a few feet away. One large paw crossed slowly over the edge of the stone circle. And for the first time that night, the Alpha King looked away from the robed men entirely. As though they no longer mattered. As though the only thing worth noticing stood directly in front of him. Then, low enough to feel more than hear, a deep voice finally broke the silence. You stood between them and fear. The words settled into the clearing like snowfall, quiet but impossible to ignore. You stood between them and fear. Evelyn forgot the cold for a second. Forgot the robed men watching from the edges of the stone circle. Forgot the fear that had followed her most of her life like a second shadow. Nobody had ever said something like that to her before. Nobody important anyway. Nobody powerful. Usually people spoke about what she lacked. Too weak. Too quiet. Too soft to matter. But standing beneath the silver solstice moon, with 6 royal pups huddled safely beside him, the Alpha King looked at her as if bravery had been the first thing he noticed. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. Evelyn stopped herself. The words sounded too small in her head now. Too ordinary for something that had somehow changed the entire night. She glanced toward the pups instead. The smallest one sat wrapped awkwardly inside her scarf, tiny silver tail flicking once against the snow. Another leaned sleepily against the Alpha King's side, clearly exhausted now that safety had arrived. They looked frightened, she finished quietly. And nobody should feel alone when they are scared. Something unreadable flickered through the Alpha King's silver gaze. Not pity. Not amusement. Recognition, perhaps. Or memory. For one strange moment, the terrible weight people always attached to his name seemed to disappear. He looked tired suddenly. Not weak. Never weak. But burdened in a way she had not expected. Like someone who had spent too long carrying responsibilities nobody else could fully understand. The largest pup looked up at him quietly. She stayed, it whispered. Even when they told her not to. The smallest nodded immediately. She gave me her scarf, it added proudly, like this detail mattered very much. Evelyn felt warmth creep into her face again despite the bitter cold. The Alpha King lowered his gaze briefly toward the scarf draped unevenly across silver fur. Then his eyes returned to her. Most wolves would have walked away, he said, voice deep and steady enough to seem older than the mountains surrounding them. Especially when frightened. Evelyn almost laughed at that. Frightened. She had been terrified. Still was honestly. Her knees felt unsteady now that the danger seemed to be loosening its grip. I almost did, she admitted softly. Honesty surprised even her. But they trusted me. Her voice dropped quieter. Nobody should be abandoned when they are afraid. Silence followed. Gentle this time. Not dangerous. Snow continued falling softly around them, catching in dark fur and loose strands of Evelyn's brown hair. Somewhere overhead, clouds shifted just enough for moonlight to brighten the clearing. Then something unexpected happened. The Alpha King stepped closer again. Not enough to frighten her. Just enough that warmth from his enormous form softened the cold air around them. Pine and winter frost wrapped quietly through her senses. Steady. Safe. Without a word, he lowered his head toward the smallest pup. The little thing blinked sleepily before nudging her scarf with its nose. Then, to Evelyn's surprise, the Alpha King carefully lifted the edge of his heavy cloak from where it rested across his broad shoulders, and draped part of it around the pups gathered closest to him. Warmth immediately surrounded the tiny group. Gentle. Protective. Somehow, impossibly human despite the terrifying form he still wore. The smallest pup looked up sleepily and whispered, Uncle Cashin always says brave wolves protect others. Then it blinked slowly toward Evelyn. So you are brave too. Something inside Evelyn cracked quietly open. Nobody had ever called her brave before. Not once in her entire life. She opened her mouth to answer, but before words came, movement behind them shifted the moment. Entirely. One of the robed men stepped nervously forward, lowering his head. Your Majesty, he began carefully, voice strained. Surely there has been some misunderstanding. The clearing changed instantly. Warmth vanished. And for the first time that night, The Alpha King turned his silver gaze toward the men who had brought fear into the woods. The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop the moment the Alpha King turned his attention away from Evelyn and toward the robed men. Snow continued falling softly, but the quiet warmth that had briefly settled around the pups disappeared beneath something colder. Heavier. Authority filled the space so completely it felt almost physical. The largest pup shifted closer to his side, pressing silver fur carefully against dark black fur as though reminding itself safety had returned. The smallest one remained wrapped in Evelyn's scarf, tiny eyes darting nervously between the adults. A misunderstanding? The Alpha King's voice came low and controlled, steady enough to make the words somehow more unsettling. Not anger. Not shouting. Just certainty. The tallest robed man lowered his head further. Your Majesty, he said carefully, we acted only to protect the kingdom. There were signs. Warnings. The solstice rituals. He stopped abruptly when silver eyes settled fully on him. Evelyn had never seen someone go quiet so fast. You removed 6 royal heirs from protected lands, the Alpha King said evenly. You isolated children. His gaze flicked briefly toward the frightened pups before returning. And you frightened them. Something about those last words landed differently. Smaller. Quieter. But somehow harder to ignore. The smallest pup tucked closer into Evelyn's side at once, tiny body still trembling from exhaustion despite relief. Evelyn instinctively rested a careful hand against silver fur. Warm. Safe. The pup leaned into her touch immediately. Across the clearing, the gray-bearded man swallowed visibly. We believed we were preventing disaster, he said quickly. The old prophecies warned. Children are not disasters. The Alpha King's voice never rose, but the entire clearing seemed to still around the words. Even the wind softened. Evelyn blinked. Something shifted unexpectedly inside her chest again. She had spent most of her life around wolves who treated weakness like inconvenience. Wolves who measured worth through power, status, strength. But here stood the most feared alpha in the Northern Territory speaking about frightened children as if their fear mattered. As if safety mattered. The smallest pup looked up sleepily. We told them we wanted to go home, it whispered softly. The Alpha King lowered his head briefly toward the child. You are home now, he said. The words carried something surprisingly gentle. Promise. Protection. One by one, the tension slowly left the pups' tiny bodies. One leaned against his shoulder. Another yawned despite everything, clearly too exhausted to stay frightened anymore. Evelyn suddenly felt tired too. The kind of exhaustion that arrives only after fear finally loosens its grip. Her hands trembled faintly now that adrenaline had nowhere left to go. She glanced down, embarrassed to notice melted snow had soaked through her boots entirely. She probably looked ridiculous standing here among royalty with messy hair and frozen fingers. The Alpha King looked toward her again then, silver eyes lingering just long enough to make her pulse stumble for reasons she did not fully understand. You remained, he said quietly, even after you understood who they were. Evelyn hesitated. That part still felt unreal. Royal heirs. Solstice rituals. The Alpha King standing 10 feet away speaking to her directly. It all felt impossible. They still looked scared, she admitted softly. Royal or not. Something unreadable flickered briefly through his expression again. Respect perhaps. Surprise. Before she could think too hard about it, movement sounded deeper in the forest. Horses. More wolves approaching. Fast. The roped men visibly stiffened. The Alpha King did not even turn. My guard has arrived, he said calmly. This ends tonight. Relief moved visibly through the clearing. The pups relaxed further. Evelyn finally allowed herself one slow breath. It was over. Or at least she thought it was. Then the smallest pup tugged weakly at her sleeve and whispered something that made her heart stop completely. Do not leave, it said quietly. Uncle Cashin likes you. The smallest pup's whisper landed harder than it should have. Uncle Cashin likes you. Evelyn almost laughed from pure disbelief. The Alpha King? Like her? The idea felt impossible enough to belong in someone else's life entirely. She was an Omega healer from the forgotten edge of Ash Hollow Pack. A girl most wolves barely noticed unless they needed herbs or someone quiet enough to clean up after problems nobody wanted to talk about. Important men did not notice wolves like her. Kings definitely did not. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching riders broke fully through the forest. Hooves struck frozen ground in steady rhythm, fast enough to scatter snow beneath dark trees. Moments later, wolves in black winter armor emerged from the shadows, silver crests gleaming faintly across their cloaks. Royal Guard. Real Royal Guard. The clearing shifted instantly. The roped men lowered their heads further. Tension settled heavily over them, the kind that arrives when consequences finally catch up. The Alpha King did not need to say anything. He simply stood there, impossibly calm, silver eyes steady as winter itself while the guards moved carefully through the clearing. One knelt immediately beside the pups, relief visible across his face. "Thank the moon," he breathed quietly. "We have searched all night." The largest pup yawned sleepily. Another leaned harder against dark fur beside them, clearly too exhausted to understand fully that danger had finally passed. The smallest still stood wrapped awkwardly inside Evelyn's scarf, tiny silver eyes refusing to leave her face. "She protected us," it announced proudly to the arriving guards. Even when everyone else was scary. Heat rushed into Evelyn's cheeks so quickly she nearly looked away. Nobody had ever introduced her as brave before. Usually people use words like quiet, strange, broken. The Alpha King turned his attention briefly toward the captain of the guard. "See that the heirs are returned safely," he said calmly. "No child spends another night frightened." The captain bowed. "Immediately. At once, Your Majesty." Again that strange unexpected gentleness. Not softness exactly. Certainty. The kind that made promises feel real. Evelyn suddenly became aware of how tired she was. Her boots were soaked through, fingers numb from cold, her scarf gone, hair tangled from wind. Embarrassment crept in unexpectedly. She probably looked ridiculous standing among royal guards while covered in snow and forest dirt. Slowly, she bent to pick up the basket of spilled herbs she had nearly forgotten existed. "I should go," she said quietly, mostly to herself. The words felt oddly disappointing once spoken aloud. She had a small cabin waiting. A leaking roof. Quiet. The same life she had walked away from only hours earlier. Before she could take more than one step, the Alpha King spoke again. "Evelyn Hale." Her breath caught. He knew her name. Somehow that unsettled her more than everything else combined. She turned slowly. Silver eyes rested on her with quiet focus. Not rushed. Not distant. Intentional. "The kingdom owes you a debt," he said. "My family owes you one." Evelyn opened her mouth immediately.